People, what is not a bullet you dodged, but a huge tactical nuke you dodged? In college, I started dating this girl. She was attractive, but also a bit crazy, though it was the fun, exciting kind of crazy. We hadn't slept together yet, but it was pretty clear that was coming soon. She didn't like using protection, but assured me she was on the pill. A small warning bell went off in my head, but it wasn't loud enough to stop me. Then 9/11 happened, and one of her exes was about to be deployed to the Middle East. She called me in tears one day, admitting that she'd slept with him one last time before he left, thinking it was a safe time in her cycle. Turns out, she got pregnant. She dropped out of school and started pushing me to help support the baby because, according to her, I was part of her life and needed to be part of the baby's life too. I wasn't having any of it. I told her if she wanted child support, she needed to find the guy who actually got her pregnant. I blocked her number, then reached out to a lawyer friend to start laying the groundwork for a restraining order and a paternity test because I was 100% sure the baby wasn't mine. Luckily, I never needed either one. I later found out she sued the guy for child support and lost. Last I heard, she's living somewhere deep in the South, with 4 kids, working at a carryout, and constantly complaining on Facebook about how everyone around her is a deadbeat. Story 2. When I was 16, I had a good friend whose father was a wealthy businessman. We lived in Chicago, and I found out that his dad had gotten mixed up with the wrong person, somehow involving a mobster or, as my friend put it, the mobster's wife. I never got the full story, but I do know that I witnessed his dad being threatened by 2 well-dressed, clearly Italian men in a black Cadillac, right at the tennis courts. I was sitting with my friend when it happened, and it played out exactly like something you'd see in a movie. My friend casually told me that there was a contract out on his dad. At the time, I thought that sounded pretty cool, at least until I realized what it meant. That week, my friend invited me to go on a fishing trip with him, his dad, and his dad's friend on Lake Michigan. But just a couple of days before the trip, something came up with my family, and we had to leave for Cincinnati. When I came back, I learned that my friend's remains was found floating in Lake Michigan. He was wearing a life vest. His dad, his dad's friend, and the boat were all gone. They never found any of them. The police even questioned me about what I knew and who I'd seen talking to my friend's dad, but I was careful not to give too much detail. I couldn't describe them clearly, and I made sure I didn't say anything that would make me stand out. In the end, Chris, the coolest guy I knew, wasn't with us anymore. And no one ever found his dad, the friend, or the boat. It was a calm day on Lake Michigan, with a nice boat, and something terrible happened out there. I've always felt like I narrowly escaped getting caught up in something I might not have been able to get away from. Story 3. Nuke Dodge 1. My ex had some kind of breakdown one night, and I woke up to find her standing over me holding a butcher knife. She was in some sort of catatonic state, completely unresponsive, and I honestly had no idea what was going on. I stayed completely still, unsure whether she even knew I was awake. After a while, she quietly left the room, only to return a few moments later, no butcher knife in hand. She climbed into bed next to me, snuggled up like nothing had happened, and we just went on with our day like it was normal. She made me a delicious batch of waffles for breakfast and was as cheerful as ever. I didn't get stabbed, but I still have trouble sleeping unless I'm alone in the room. That whole experience really left me shaken. Nuke Dodge 2. Another ex cheated on me, and this one was particularly crazy. She'd been talking about wanting to have a baby, and at the time, I thought we were both on the same page. But after we broke up, she ended up marrying the guy she cheated on me with. They had a baby, and things seemed like they were settling down, but then she cheated on him too. They got divorced, and now her ex-husband, who I guess is technically her kid's father, is paying child support even though the child isn't his. So, to sum it up, her ex gets stuck with the bill for a kid that isn't even his. It's wild. Life has its ways of working out, but sometimes it feels like the universe just throws some really strange curveballs your way. Story 4. I was chatting with a guy on Grindr who looked cute, and we seemed to hit it off. The only issue was that he lived too far away, and as a student without a car or the ability to host in my dorm, meeting up just wasn't an option. Later, I found out he had been arrested for deliberately spreading HIV through Grindr hookups. This happened in Edinburgh. For the record, this was before PrEP was available in Scotland, but that's not even the point. I never mention my safe sex practices because they're irrelevant to the situation. I was actually on PrEP at the time, but that doesn't change the fact that I completely dodged a bullet, not just from potential exposure, but from encountering someone with incredibly malicious intent. This guy made national news, not just for intentionally spreading HIV, but also for blackmailing men he had slept with. Story 5. I was once briefly engaged to a man who, over time, has cheated on his beautiful, intelligent, and incredibly kind wife countless times. They are currently separated, but they have 2 young children, and it seems like there's a strong possibility they could reconcile. I broke off our engagement when he nonchalantly explained that he thought it was perfectly acceptable for a man to cheat on his wife if they'd been married for a while and he'd gotten bored. What made it worse was that he didn't think the same rule applied to women. He believed women should never cheat. Looking back now, I can't help but feel an immense amount of sympathy for his poor wife. She didn't deserve any of this. He started cheating on her only 2 years into their marriage, while she was pregnant with their first child. It's heartbreaking to think about the pain she must have felt, especially during such a vulnerable time in her life. I can only imagine how much trust and love she had invested in their relationship and how deeply betrayed she must feel now. Story 6. One night, I woke up with some chest pains and told my wife. She got a little scared, thinking it might be a heart attack, and we agreed I should head to the ER. The nurses there seemed to think it was a false alarm but decided to run an EKG just as a precaution. In my mind, I was hoping the chest pain would return, not because I wanted a heart attack, but so we could finally figure out what was causing the discomfort. The EKG was performed by a veteran nurse and a newer one, and I kept an eye on the screen as they worked. Suddenly, something flashed on the screen that made both nurses look at each other in disbelief. They ran the test again, and one of them stepped out to get help while the other told my wife and daughter to wait in the waiting room. Just seconds later, 5 or 6 more people entered the room calmly and started prepping me for something. It turned out that I was, in fact, having my second heart attack that night, right there in the ER. The doctors and nurses had found an obstruction in my heart and were preparing to clear it and place a stent. When I woke up from surgery, the doctor who inserted the stent told me, "You probably picked the best time and place to have a heart attack. Right here in the ER." Edit. One funny moment during this whole ordeal was when the doctor told me that there are 2 potential entry points for the stent placement, one in the wrist and the other in your groin. The male ER nurse had to prep the groin area just in case the wrist method wasn't viable. Luckily for me, the wrist entry worked just fine. Story 7. When I turned 30 in 2010, I lost a significant amount of weight. Until then, I'd always looked my age or even a bit older, but suddenly, I appeared to be about 5 to 10 years younger. It was a huge confidence boost, and I began spending more time in Allston, a neighborhood in Boston known for its lively nightlife, often hanging out with people in their early 20s. There was one guy who really stood out to me in the area. I never saw him inside any of the bars, but he was always walking down Brighton Avenue or North Beacon Street, usually carrying a gym bag and always alone. He had a distinctive Eurotrash vibe to his style, something unusual for most Bostonians who tended to dress more understated. He had a light olive complexion, smooth skin, and dark hair, which he always wore slicked back. What I remember most vividly about him was that every time I saw him, he wore reflective aviator sunglasses, so I never got a chance to see his eyes. I started calling him Aviator Dude. Feeling confident in my new look, I decided I'd try to strike up a conversation with him. The first few times I attempted to make eye contact, I got nothing. No response, no acknowledgement. At first, I thought he was just unfriendly or not interested, but I wasn't ready to give up just yet. Maybe he hadn't noticed me. Finally, one crisp autumn day in 2010, I found myself standing across the street from him, waiting for the light to change. I saw this as my opportunity. When the light switched to walk, I made direct eye contact with him, flashed a flirtatious smile, and then, without thinking, winked at him. Instant regret hit me immediately. Aviator Dude froze in his tracks. His jaw dropped slightly, then his lips curled into a sneer. Even though I couldn't see his eyes behind the aviators, I could tell from the look on his face that he was disgusted. Feeling awkward, I kept walking past him. As I glanced back, I saw him still standing in the middle of the intersection at North Beacon and Cambridge Streets, staring at me with a look of complete revulsion. He shook his head in disbelief, wrung his hands in frustration, and muttered something under his breath as he walked off. Well, that didn't go as planned. Fast forward 5 years, and I would come to see Aviator Dude again. This time, not in person. In 2015, I was following the trial of the Boston Marathon bomber, Dzhokhar Tsarnaev, on Twitter and the news. During the trial, there were photos shown of his older brother, Tamerlan Tsarnaev, who had been killed in a shootout with police. And that's when it hit me. Tamerlan Tsarnaev was Aviator Dude. I instantly recognized him. Not only was Tamerlan Tsarnaev one of the radicalized terrorists responsible for the bombing that shook Massachusetts, but the trial also revealed that he had been abusive to those around him, particularly women. His ex-girlfriend had filed a domestic violence charge that had delayed his U.S. citizenship application, and witnesses testified to him being verbally abusive and throwing furniture at his wife. There were even suspicions that he might have been involved in a triple homicide in Waltham, Massachusetts, in 2011, just a year after I'd crossed paths with him. Looking back, I'm grateful that Aviator Dude rejected me. That moment of humiliation now seems like a blessing in disguise. Story 8. I was driving home from visiting my brother in Vermont when a snowstorm hit. I wasn't very experienced with driving in heavy snow, and I lost control of the car completely. It swerved off the road, and I was headed straight for a giant boulder at about 50 or 60 miles per hour. In that moment, everything seemed to slow down. I had a brief moment to reflect on my life and, strangely, I said goodbye to my body, thinking the impact was inevitable. Then, out of nowhere, I was jolted back to reality by a sudden impact, but when I looked, the boulder was still about 20 or 30 feet away. I managed to get out of the car, shaken but unharmed, and when I looked around, I saw I had actually hit a small, skinny tree, something I could have easily grabbed with one hand. But what I hadn't seen was the huge root system underneath. The roots had lifted the car off the ground and stopped me just short of the boulder. The car was totaled, but I walked away completely fine, thanks to that little tree. There's no way I would have survived hitting the boulder head-on. Story 9. I married my high school sweetheart when I was 23, and she was 21. We'd been together for about 5 years, and at the time, we were madly in love with each other. Our relationship felt like it was heading in the perfect direction. We married in April, and just a month later, in May, she told me she was pregnant. She had taken a test with her friend after feeling unwell, and without hesitation, I was ecstatic. I didn't ask to see the test. She'd already thrown it away, so I took her word for it. I was so happy, excited to become a father, imagining our future with a little one on the way. But things quickly started to feel off. She wouldn't let me attend any of the doctor's visits, and at first, I gave her the benefit of the doubt, thinking it might just be about privacy. But then, something felt wrong. By the time we were around 6 months into the pregnancy, she wasn't showing at all. Her belly wasn't growing, and I began to get suspicious. I confronted her, and she lashed out at me with all the usual questions. How could you? And don't you trust me? She even pointed to some weight gain she had, but I still wasn't convinced. I reminded her that if there was something wrong, if she wasn't really pregnant, I would help her get the help she needed, and I would support her no matter what. She insisted it wasn't necessary. Over time, she started gaining more weight, especially in her stomach, so I kept moving forward as if she were still pregnant. We picked out a name, bought clothes in the first few sizes, and set up a beautifully decorated nursery. My family was supportive, though they had their suspicions. Then came the 8th month, and by that point, it was undeniably clear she wasn't pregnant. I had already found her ultrasound images online, which didn't match up with what she had told me. Her weight gain stopped, and there were medical issues that didn't align with the pregnancy. Despite everything, I still tried to be patient with her, even though it was becoming harder to ignore the truth. The due date came and went, and when I asked about it, she told me it was normal, that sometimes babies can be 2 weeks late. I gave it 2 weeks, then laid down the ultimatum. Either we go to the hospital together to check on the pregnancy, or I was done. She agreed to go, but I wasn't allowed to go in with her. She told the doctors that her visit was related to her pancreas, never mentioning anything about a pregnancy. I was allowed to visit her in the room afterward, and when I looked her in the eye, I told her it was over. The emotional fallout was severe. She didn't take it well. She disappeared, took on a new name, and avoided the divorce process for as long as she could. She evaded the process server and ran from her responsibilities. It's been years since then, and I'm still not divorced because of her attempts to avoid the legalities. The aftermath was brutal. She spread rumors about me, claiming I had abandoned her and that I was abusive, going as far as to say I caused her to lose the baby. The day after I left, she returned to the house, attacked me, and then called the police, claiming I had thrown her to the ground. Thankfully, I had witnesses who were there to back up my version of the story, and it didn't result in any charges. But that wasn't the end of it. She filed an emergency protective order against me, had me thrown out of our home, and took everything with her. Items that I had paid for or brought into the marriage. I lost all my heirlooms, keepsakes, and photos from my childhood. It was devastating, and to this day, I have little left of my past. The impact of this experience has been profound. My reputation was tarnished, and I've been left with a deep distrust of relationships. I went through years of depression, struggling to get back on my feet. I tried dating again, but my emotional baggage made it hard. I ended up in another relationship, and, in an effort to do the right thing, I stayed when my new girlfriend became pregnant. But soon enough, It became clear she had her own mental health issues, which ultimately led to child neglect and abuse. I ended up with full custody of my son. Things only got worse when my ex-wife tried to team up with my ex-girlfriend to take me down. They filed a false protective order against me, drained my home of everything, and fled the state with my son. Thankfully, I had learned from the past and had been keeping detailed records, so when they made their claims, I was able to protect myself. I won the case, but not without enduring emotional and financial turmoil. In the end, I won. But at what cost? My trust in people is shattered. My ability to connect with others has been crippled, and it's been an ongoing struggle to rebuild any sense of normalcy. The scars, both emotional and psychological, remain with me, and the battle to heal is still far from over. Story 10. When I was a physics major, I had a pretty intense romance with a fellow physics student that started when I was a teenager. He was always talking about marriage and starting a family, and at the time, I was pretty infatuated, so I didn't mind the discussions. But I started getting uncomfortable when he began talking about how we'd have our first kids by the time we were in grad school, when I was only 20 years old. Around this time, I was also dealing with SA from a professor, and when I confided in him about it, his response was, "That sucks, but it's going to happen to women in physics." Anyway, we ended up breaking up because he chose another girl, an artist. When I heard his reasons, it stung. He told me that he liked how she didn't understand a word of what I'm talking about when I get home. And this part hurt the most. She's a good cook. 20-year-old me was devastated. I really like this guy, and looking back, I definitely should have spoken up more and not held back. Fast forward to my 30s, and I'm now a professional astronomer. He's still on the path we talked about, with 3 kids, the last I checked. Honestly, I'm just so relieved things didn't work out. At that age, I didn't know enough about myself, and now I see how incompatible we were. He had some pretty traditional views, and I realize now he wasn't the right person for me. I'm so grateful for the rich life and career I've built for myself. If we had stayed together, I'm not sure I would have had the same opportunities or growth. Story 11. In 10th grade, I was head over heels in love with a man. Yes, a full-grown man who was at least 21. He ended up ghosting me and then started dating my best friend, which completely shattered me. A few months later, I noticed some unsettling changes in her. This beautiful girl with green eyes and an amazing body started dressing in oversized men's clothes, stopped participating in sports, and withdrew from all our usual activities. She just seemed tired and sad all the time. It turned out that this guy had been an abusive, manipulative, and controlling monster. He completely isolated her. He forbade her from speaking to anyone at school unless it was absolutely necessary. He even got her a cell phone, so he could call her between classes to make sure she wasn't talking to anyone else. By senior year, he had gotten her pregnant, and right after graduation, he moved her to a new town where she didn't know anyone, just to isolate her even more. Looking back, I realize how easily that could have been me. I was a sucker in high school, totally boy crazy. I know I would have fallen into that trap without even realizing what was happening. It's a terrifying thought. Story 12. I ended up injuring my belly button after overindulging at a company lunch, turning my innie into an outie, a hernia. I procrastinated going to the doctor for a few weeks before seeing a specialist. The doctor confirmed it was indeed a hernia, but since it was during the pandemic, they said I could schedule the surgery whenever, with no rush. I decided to get it done and booked an appointment for the following week after cancellation. When I woke up from the surgery, the doctor informed me there had been a complication. They hadn't been able to address the hernia right away because, as they were going in, they noticed my appendix was on the verge of bursting. So, they removed my appendix instead of fixing the hernia, still not the tactical nuke I was expecting. I asked when they would deal with the hernia, and the doctor said the appendix looked odd, so they sent it to the lab for further analysis. The lab was backed up because of the pandemic, so weeks later, I got a call. It turns out the lab found I had a rare form of appendix cancer, something that affects around 1,000 Americans per year. And of the 2 types of appendix cancer, I had the worst one, the kind that spreads rapidly and significantly reduces your lifespan, even with treatment. The first type is slow-growing and stays localized, but occasionally it goes into overdrive, spreads cancerous slime, and turns whatever it touches into more cancer. The cutoff for it turning aggressive is a 1-centimeter tumor, and mine was 1.5 centimeters. Under the microscope, they saw the cells that produce the cancer slime. The only treatment for this is major surgery, known as the mother of all surgeries, which is its own ball of tactical nukes. I took some time to process that news while waiting for more tests to be scheduled, pandemic delays, of course. After a series of scans and tests, the results came back mostly clear, showing no signs of cancer spreading. It had just turned from the slow-growing type to the fast-spreading one, but it hadn't yet had the chance to spread the mucin. If I had waited even a week for my hernia surgery, the odds of the cancer spreading would have increased exponentially. Fortunately, they think they got it all when they removed the appendix. There were a few areas they wanted to monitor, but they're confident it's just scar tissue from the surgery. I was given an 80% chance of being cancer-free, with follow-up scans scheduled for December. Update December 30th. My December scans came back great. The area they were concerned about shrank, as expected if it was just scar tissue. While I'm not completely out of the woods yet, they'll continue routine scans for the next 5 to 6 years. Each scan improves my chances. I'm scheduled to have the hernia surgery in 3 months, and my oncologist will be there to check for any potential issues while the surgeon is operating. Story 13. After a night of partying to celebrate our high school graduation, a group of us decided we wanted to watch the sun come up at a local beach. It seemed like a perfect way to cap off the night. But there wasn't a sober person among us, and one guy, let's call him Dave, volunteered to drive. He had a minivan, and despite all of us being in no condition to drive, he insisted he was sober enough to get us there. A few of us were hesitant and suggested we could just watch the sunrise from the deck of the house, but Dave was adamant, saying it was only a short drive. I had a bad feeling about it. It's hard to explain, but something just didn't sit right with me. In the end, a few of us decided to stay behind, just to sleep it off and avoid going. The rest of the group piled into the van, with no one wearing seatbelts, and off they went. A few hours later, around 8 a.m., we were woken up to the ringing of phones going off non-stop, calls from concerned parents, frantic voices, and the sound of sirens in the distance. It was chaos. In those pre-cell phone days, we didn't have a quick way to check in, so all the news came in like a punch to the gut. The group had been in a horrific single-car rollover accident. The van had flipped, and of the 6 people in it, 4 had passed. No one was wearing a seatbelt. The police report later said they must have taken a curve at around 160 kilometers per hour, way too fast for anyone to survive. The summer that followed was brutal. The loss was felt so deeply, and the shock didn't wear off quickly. It was hard to look at anything the same way after that. Every time we tried to make sense of it, the weight of it would hit again. I couldn't help but feel like I should have gone. Like maybe I could have done something, anything, to stop it. It left me grappling with survivor's guilt and a heavy, suffocating sadness. Survivor's guilt is real. Depression is real. You think you're fine, that you've moved on. But sometimes the weight of something like this sticks with you, quietly, in ways you never expect. Story 14. I own a few acres of woodland that I manage with a chainsaw to maintain a healthy mix of tree species and prevent overcrowding. Often, when I'm cutting down a tree that's too close to others, it won't fall as expected. Instead, it just leans against the surrounding trees. When that happens, I have to make a series of angled cuts, allowing chunks of the trunk to slide off more or less vertically onto the ground. Over time, the trunk becomes vertical enough that I can finally push it toward a clear space and complete the felling. A couple of years ago, I was working on a tree that had reached that point. The trunk was basically vertical, with several thousand pounds of wood balanced precariously, about 30 feet high. I made another cut, and the rest of the trunk slid off the 3 feet I had already separated at the base. And then, it started to lean. That tree was coming down. The problem was, it wasn't falling in the direction I had planned. No big deal, I thought, just step out of the way. But I'd gotten careless. I hadn't cleared the area properly, and I found myself stuck with branches at my feet, unable to move. To my alarm, I realized I was rooted to the spot, which, unfortunately, was right in the path of the falling tree. It ended up just nicking my head as it crashed to the ground. Had it been a few inches closer, it could have been a lot worse. Now, I always make sure the area around me is completely clear of branches before I take on a tree. It's a lesson I've learned the hard way. Story 15. When I was 24, I developed a sore on my tongue that wouldn't go away, and it was starting to really bother me. My boyfriend's dad was a dentist, so one evening when I was over at his house, I asked him to take a quick look. He recommended I see an oral surgeon the next day for a closer evaluation. The next morning, I thought the sore felt a little better, so I tried to cancel the appointment. But my boyfriend's dad insisted that I still go, so I did. When I saw the oral surgeon, he diagnosed it almost immediately as cancer. It turned out to be an aggressive form, and by the time I had surgery to remove it, it had already spread to multiple lymph nodes. They ended up removing more than half of my tongue, and I had to undergo both chemo and radiation afterward. Looking back, I often think about how if I had put off that doctor's visit any longer, I probably wouldn't have survived. It's been a long road, but I'm coming up on my 10-year anniversary of remission in January, and I'm grateful every day that I didn't wait. Story 16. I was walking to work one winter morning, and as I passed under a skybridge, I took a step forward, halfway through my stride, when a massive icicle, taller than me, 6 feet, and about 2 feet around at the base, came crashing down right in front of my nose. If my bus had been just a half second earlier, or if I had walked even slightly faster, I would have been impaled, from head to toe. I stood there frozen for a moment, quietly processing how close I had come to death. There was another pedestrian nearby who had witnessed the whole thing. When I looked at him, his wide-eyed, ashen expression told me everything I needed to know, just how narrowly fortunate I was that day. Story 17. This happened back in the days before cell phones. I had a long commute home, and on rare occasions, my husband would drive into the city to meet me. That day, I left about 15 minutes before he did. On the stretch of Highway 101 that I needed to be on for about 20 miles, there was a big rig ahead of me, and it was driving erratically. I had a strange feeling and decided to move to the next lane, speeding past him. A few moments later, I glanced in my rearview mirror and saw the big rig collide with the car in front of it. The truck flipped onto its side, crushing the cars in the lane where I had just been. I felt a wave of relief wash over me, knowing that I had narrowly avoided disaster. My husband, who was driving behind the accident, was stuck in traffic while the police directed cars to pass by in single file. As he slowly moved forward, he saw one of the crushed cars had a red bumper. He had no idea if it was mine, but he couldn't shake the fear that it was. He finally got home a couple of hours after me, and when he turned down our street and saw my red car in the driveway, he said it was the happiest moment he'd had all day. He admitted he'd been holding his breath, certain that I would be under that big rig. Story 18. I was at the bar, having a casual conversation with a woman. It wasn't anything flirtatious, just light banter. When I told her I had to leave, she asked if I could give her a ride. Since I was headed that way anyway, it didn't seem like a big deal. We pulled into her driveway, and through the window, I could see a guy sitting at a computer in the living room. I asked her who it was, and she casually replied, "That's my husband. He's a pansy. I'll bring him outside, and you scare him off. Then we can have the house to ourselves for the night." As soon as she said that, every alarm bell in my head went off. My mind was racing, thinking, how do I get out of this situation without making a scene? So, I just said, "Sounds good." The moment she stepped toward the door, I slammed it into gear, and without a second thought, I burned rubber out of there as fast as I could. Story 19. My father-in-law was working on the construction of a power plant as a union pipe fitter. He was scheduled to work on a Sunday, but the day before, he received a call from another company asking him to oversee a job much closer to his home, about a 5-minute commute instead of a 50-minute one. He decided to take the closer job, so he didn't go to the power plant on Sunday. Later that day, there was an explosion at the plant, and several people from his crew were harmed. Edit. To clarify, this happened at the plant in Middletown, Connecticut. It was a significant event for the state and even made national news, so I'm not surprised so many of you recognized where it happened. I'm sure my father-in-law wasn't the only one who missed work that day, especially since it was also Super Bowl Sunday. Story 20. Yesterday, I was helping my fiancé's dad trim some tree limbs in his yard. He was using a lift to cut branches hanging dangerously over a steel propane tank, which contained $1,500 worth of propane. He cut one of the limbs, and it hit the tank with the loudest bang I've ever heard. Propane started pouring out of the top like smoke from a mortar. He struggled to bring the lift down enough to jump out and run for his life. Later, we found out that the limb had hit the gas valve, causing it to fall straight into the tank. If it had sparked, it wouldn't have mattered how far we ran. We'd all have passed. Him, me, and my fiancé, who was inside showering and completely unaware. Now, he's out $1,500 in gas and almost lost his life. The crazy part? I saw him smoking while he was up there. There's no way we should be alive, but somehow we are. The gas is still leaking after 24 hours. Edit. He's having professionals take care of it now. We're only stupid with power equipment. Story 21. I interviewed for a technical position at a company in New Hampshire that specialized in making jams, baking mixes, lollipops, and other products. The interview started off on a strange note when the president, who was the owner's daughter, spent the majority of our conversation trashing their current consultant. She didn't stop there. She even made fun of his degrees, which was a huge red flag for me right away. Then, I had a conversation with the owner, and he was even more off-putting. He took a call during our chat and told the person on the other end, "I'll pay you when I pay you," which made me wonder if they were struggling with cash flow. When it came to my education, his question was, "What can your fancy degrees do for me?" It felt like he didn't value qualifications or experience, and that made me uncomfortable. Next, I met the VP of marketing. She asked me how many recalls I had handled. I told her none. That's not really part of my role. She seemed confused and asked, "Wait, what interview is this?" At that point, I knew this wasn't the right fit for me, so I declined their offer. Fast forward about 5 years, and I was talking to a guy about doing some consulting work. We got onto the subject of that same company, and he revealed that he had interviewed there as well. He had the same uncomfortable vibe and also declined their offer. It turns out, they were in the process of trying to sell the company and were making it look better for appearances. After the sale, it came to light that they had been directing their current clients to their next venture. In the end, their financial and business practices almost landed them in jail. Looking back, I'm really glad I steered clear of that mess. It would have been a nightmare to get involved with that kind of operation. Story 22. In university, my two best friends and I were drinking, playing Mario Kart, and just hanging out. We got hungry, but it was late, and most delivery places had closed by 1:30 a.m. I suggested we just make a Tombstone pizza since we'd been drinking, but one of my friends said he was fine to drive to get McDonald's. I argued it was a bad idea, but he managed to convince the other guy to go with him. After waiting for a while and realizing McDonald's shouldn't take 2 hours, I decided to ride my scooter since it was only a couple of miles away. On the way there, I noticed a taped-off area on the bridge right before McDonald's. There were cops, an ambulance, and a crane. The car had gone off the bridge, driven off the side, and landed top-first in a shallow creek below. The people inside had passed away on impact. I narrowly avoided what felt like a death sentence, but ended up carrying the weight of survivors' guilt for nearly 5 years after. Edit. I want to add a few things. 1. I'm doing okay now. The depression and fear of driving stuck with me for a while, but moving back home for a couple of semesters really helped me heal compared to being alone in the college apartment. 2. For clarification, it was one of those old-school Razor scooters, not a moped or electric scooter. 3. I took the keys away from the driver because I knew he was too drunk to drive, but he had a spare key. When I went to the bathroom, they left. I came out, and they were gone. I looked out the window and saw his car was already speeding off. I just said, "What an idiot. His dad's going to be livid if he gets pulled over." Story 23. I met a girl one summer, and it felt like something out of a movie. She quickly fell head over heels for me. So much so, that she even decided to ditch her fiancé for the summer to be with me. We had an intense connection, and I genuinely thought something could come of it. But when summer came to an end and she went back home, she got back together with her fiancé, and before long, they were married. A year later, I ran into her again, and it was clear she hadn't moved on. She wanted to pick up right where we had left off, as if nothing had changed. I knew I couldn't do that. I turned her down. There was just something about the whole situation that didn't feel right, and I felt like I dodged a bullet. Years passed, and then I ran into her again, this time completely out of the blue. She seemed different, a little more broken. She shared all the details of her life with me. Her husband could no longer satisfy her, she confessed. Instead of dealing with it or talking it through with him, she was seeking fulfillment from random strangers she found on the internet while her husband slept in the spare room. At this point, they had 2 kids together. I could see how worn out and unfulfilled she seemed, and honestly, I couldn't help but feel sorry for both of them. It was a sad situation all around. They had built a life, but it wasn't the life either of them had probably imagined. Story 24. My manager was actively trying to get me fired for underperformance, and at the time, I was so depressed that I genuinely believed I was a terrible employee. The company I work for has a complex process just to issue a verbal warning, let alone fire someone. So instead of going through the usual steps, my manager tried to convince me to take a severance package so that I'd leave voluntarily and save her the hassle. Not long after that conversation, I had to take sick leave. While I was out, she began the formal process to have me fired. For a while, it seemed like my fate was sealed, but I wasn't about to give up that easily. I dragged the process out for a few months, during which I discovered that she had been falsifying documents to make me look like a lost cause. I collected everything, including a detailed dossier for HR that showed her claims were completely misleading. I also documented all the times she failed to follow proper procedures. Presenting this evidence turned everything around. Instead of being fired, I was moved to a new role with a better team. For the next year, I made sure to rub it in her face just how well I was doing. I took every opportunity to share praise from the department head, knowing it would get back to her. It was frustrating that she didn't get fired, but I understood that doing so would have caused too much fallout for management. Despite that, I went from being on the verge of unemployment to experiencing clear success. Story 25. When we were younger, my best friend was approached by a guy we both knew just a little. He was incredibly charming, suave, and debonair. Everyone liked him and encouraged her to go out with him. But she got this weird, creepy vibe from him and turned him down. Fast forward 20 years, and suddenly he's all over the news. Turns out, he was arrested as a serial killer. He'd charm women, take them on dates, and then murder them. He'd started his spree around the time he asked her out. If she had agreed to go, she would have been one of his first 3 victims. The police even interviewed her as they tried to piece together the early years of his murder spree. Story 26. Right after I got my private pilot's license, the flight school told me I'd gone $2,000 over my loan limit and had to pay the difference out of pocket. I put it on the only credit card I had, and it didn't take long before I felt the weight of the interest piling up. At the time, I was working at Starbucks, earning just $9 an hour, but quickly jumped to higher-paying jobs. I also had to keep up with monthly loan payments, a car note, and bills. Thankfully, I was living with my parents, but between all the payments, I was shelling out nearly $1,000 a month. I bounced around jobs, averaging about 8 months at each place. From Starbucks to Target, to loading UPS planes, and eventually working both at Whole Foods and Amazon simultaneously. The Whole Foods manager set up an awesome schedule for me, 11 a.m. to 7 p.m. at Whole Foods, and then 8 p.m. to 1 a.m. at Amazon. During all of this, I had a girlfriend who was also studying, but she never seemed to understand the stress I was under. When I started working 2 jobs, her response was simply, "What about me?" One night, after leaving Amazon, I was too tired to chat with a coworker and just wanted to get home. I got to my car, pulled up to the stop sign, made a left turn, and bam, a kid speeding in his mom's Nissan Altima hit me. It was a dark road with no streetlights, and they were going at least 90 miles per hour. Their car flipped over the divider, and mine spun out multiple times, hitting theirs again while I was spinning. All I remember is seeing the car go dark and gripping the wheel. When I came to, I had to crawl out of the passenger seat before realizing something was wrong with my knee and shoulder. I was rushed to the hospital and told I'd need surgery. My girlfriend visited me during this time, but I cried alone, thinking about how I was going to handle everything. Eventually, I was sent home in a wheelchair. The first night, my girlfriend came over, and she suggested taking me for a walk, which was pretty absurd considering my condition. She pushed me to a bench a block from my house and said she needed to know if we'd be traveling in the next 6 months because for her, it was a must. I was caught off guard but told her to look at my situation. I'd love to go traveling, but it wasn't happening anytime soon. If she needed that, she could find someone else. She didn't say much after that, but when we got back to my house, I offered to help her find a better paying job since I was working 2 jobs paying $15 an hour and she could do the same. But that never happened. She just complained about not feeling like a priority and kept bringing up the idea of traveling. Fast forward 3 months. By then, I could barely walk again, and I was only working at Whole Foods. One day, she called to celebrate finishing therapy and wanted to go out for drinks. Of course, she brought up traveling again. I told her I was overwhelmed with my debts, hospital bills, and everything else, and she ended up apologizing. We ended the night, but she called me again before bed, begging to talk about traveling. I had enough and broke up with her the next day. 2 weeks later, my dad found a lawyer who was able to work the insurance system and get me a settlement that paid off all my debt 3 times over. This was right before COVID, so I got to stay home and finally rest, both physically and emotionally. I picked up rollerblading and started studying again. I sometimes think about how much money I would have wasted on her if I hadn't ended the relationship. I like to think I'm over it, but it still bothers me. That girl was a total emotional wrecking ball. Story 27. I used to live in this apartment above an old warehouse, and it was perfect. There was only one entrance/exit, but I loved the place. The ceiling was arched with multiple skylights, and the layout was just right for a young guy. It included water, trash, and sewer, all for $450 a month. I was making $40 an hour, so it felt like a steal. A couple of years ago, I was working Tuesday to Friday, and Mondays were my usual nap days. One Monday morning in November, I got up early at 7 a.m. to take my dog to her first teeth cleaning at the vet. After that, I thought, why not? I've got plenty of time today. So, I decided to clean the apartment. I swept, mopped, did dishes, cleaned the bathroom, did laundry, everything. By the time it was 1:50 p.m., I had finished everything, and I had a lunch meeting at 2 p.m., so I left for that. I got to the restaurant down the street, sat down, and the second my food hit the table, my phone rang. It was my friend who works for the town, and he told me he thought my apartment was on fire. I was like, what? I was just there. Everything was fine. He insisted I should go check, so I left immediately. I rushed back to the apartment, and sure enough, thick black smoke was pouring out of the bedroom window. My first thought was, oh, the fire department's on the way, they'll handle it. But nope. Soon, flames broke through the roof, and it became clear that the place was a lost cause. But honestly, the whole time I was standing there, all I could think about was how incredibly lucky I was. I had that meeting when I would normally be napping. My dog was at the vet, and my pregnant girlfriend was at work. I dodged a major bullet that day. It felt like I avoided a massive disaster. Story 28. My parents raise cattle, and their property has both a front and back pasture. Every few months, they move the cattle between the two. Our driveway runs parallel to the front pasture, and a busy street runs perpendicular to it. About 10 or 11 years ago, during a heavy rainstorm at night, a cow got loose from the front pasture. My mom, worried it might wander onto the road and get hit by a car, went out to bring it back. I was in the middle of playing video games, so I wasn't really paying attention to the time. About an hour later, she came back soaking wet, changed clothes, and went straight to bed. None of us thought much of it. Fast forward 24 hours, we got home from school to find about 10 police cars at our neighbor's house, right across from our driveway, about a quarter-mile away, plus a police chopper overhead. My mom went down there alone to see what was going on. We watched her talking with the police for about 20 minutes before she finally came back. Turns out, both of our neighbors had been murdered. And here's where my mom unknowingly dodged a serious bullet. That night in the rain, the cow had actually wandered into our neighbor's pasture across the street. Now, these neighbors had always hated us for some reason. Lots of bad blood, long history of issues. My mom figured she should let them know where the cow was so she could come back in the daylight to get it. Expecting to get screamed at, she knocked on their door. Instead, the wife answered, and, strangely, she was unusually nice. She kept insisting my mom come inside, saying things like, "Oh, look at you, all soaked. Come in and warm up." She kept pressing, trying to get my mom to step inside. But my mom refused. Eventually, she left and went home. Sometime shortly after that, both of them were murdered. When she told the police this, they started to suspect that the killer may have already been inside the house, and the wife had been trying to subtly get help. At some point, the FBI even got involved, but even after all these years, no one has ever been arrested. We still have no idea who did it. Story 29. I dated a guy I met on an app, a medical resident. He was smart, humble, and attractive, but it quickly became clear that he had some personal struggles to work through and wasn't in the right place for a relationship. We mutually decided to just be friends and hung out regularly for a few months before we naturally lost touch. About a month later, I texted him. No response. That was unusual. A week passed, and I texted again. Still nothing. I decided to call, but his number was out of service. That struck me as odd, especially for someone in the middle of a demanding residency. But I figured maybe he had changed numbers and let it go. Over the next couple of weeks, I started getting a bad feeling. Was he okay? Had something happened to him? I checked the hospital's website where he had been doing his residency. I knew he had been listed there before because I had double-checked before meeting him in person. But now, his name was gone. At this point, I was really worried. Had something happened to him? Had he gotten into trouble? So, I decided to Google his name. His picture came up immediately, next to a headline about serious criminal charges involving kids' corn. Story 30. In 2003, we spent Christmas in Thailand. I had lived there for a few years as a kid in the early 90s, and had such an amazing time that we planned to do it again the next year. Christmas morning on a beach in Phuket sounded perfect. We had everything booked, flights and all, but at the last minute, my dad wasn't allowed to leave the country due to some fallout from an Enron-adjacent scandal. He wasn't involved, but as a C-suite executive at a credit card company, he and others in similar positions were under a travel restriction. Turns out, the very hotel we were supposed to stay at was completely destroyed by the tsunami. We got unbelievably lucky. Story 31. She told me she was pregnant, and I believed without a doubt that the child was mine. For 8 months, she let me think that. 8 months of planning, stressing, and preparing to be a father. I even sold my house and moved to the other end of town so that her other child could stay in the same school. The father of that child lived in that area, so it made things more convenient for her. Looking back, it was a complicated situation, but at the time, I was just trying to do the right thing. The entire time she was pregnant, she treated me horribly. Constant criticism, endless arguments, and zero appreciation for anything I was doing to support her. I kept telling myself it was just hormones, that things would get better once the baby arrived. Then, out of nowhere, near the very end of the pregnancy, she casually dropped a bomb. By the way, the baby might not be yours. I was in shock. After everything I had done, after appending my entire life, she waited until the last moment to admit there was a chance the baby wasn't even mine. When the baby was born, I immediately got a DNA test. Sure enough, I wasn't the father. That was the moment everything became clear. Having seen the way she spoke to the father of her other child, the way she manipulated, belittled, and controlled him, I realized I had dodged more than just a bullet. I had dodged an 18-year-long nuclear disaster. Story 32. I accidentally helped someone avoid a life-threatening situation just by being nervous. I was performing at a drag party just a street away from a local LGBTQ center. The show went amazingly, and I was feeling unstoppable, so I decided to take a chance and flirt with a girl I had a crush on. We hit it off, but I was too anxious to ask for her number right away. She mentioned that she was planning to stop by the LGBTQ center after the party to say hi to some friends. I kept stalling, making up reasons to keep her there just a little longer, partly because I was waiting for the right moment, partly because I just enjoyed talking to her. The party wrapped up, her friends had already left, but we kept chatting. I stretched out our conversation for 30, maybe 40 minutes, before I finally got the nerve to ask for her number. She giggled, gave it to me, and I was over the moon. Then the phone call started. Frantic voices on the other end, full of relief the moment I picked up. She was getting them too. Everyone who had stayed behind at the party was. While we were talking, a shooter had entered the LGBTQ center, firing indiscriminately before fleeing. 2 people lost their lives. Many others were injured. She wasn't there, because I was too nervous to ask for her number. Story 33. I was dating a coworker who had a habit of lying. From the very start, I told her I wasn't interested in anything casual. If she wasn't serious or if there was someone else, I'd rather not start anything. She swore up and down that she had deep feelings for me and that I was the only one. Then one day, completely out of the blue, a random woman showed up at our workplace asking for her. In a building filled with hundreds of employees, I just happened to be the one at the front when she arrived. Curious, I asked what was going on. Turns out, she wasn't there for a friendly visit. She was looking for a fight. Apparently, the girl I was dating had been sending explicit photos to her boyfriend. If I hadn't been at the front desk at that exact moment, I might have never found out. One angry text later, she disappeared from my life for good. Story 34. Years ago, I worked for a company with an extremely controlling CEO. One day, without warning, they appointed a new manager to oversee our team. He was quickly promoted, and we clashed constantly, so much so that I was painted as a troublemaker. In reality, I was just pointing out inefficiencies and potential legal or regulatory issues in their processes. I later found out his promotion wasn't a coincidence. His role was specifically to restructure the company and push out employees who challenged the system. He was hired to create conflict and eliminate so-called problematic staff. Before long, I, along with several senior employees, received retrenchment notices. I was furious and wanted to fight back, but the others advised patience. Meanwhile, those who weren't let go refused to support us. They acted sympathetic, but were clearly smug about keeping their positions. For a brief moment, I considered giving in, begging to keep my job, but thankfully, I didn't. The CEO had planned to gain majority control of the company by assuming the senior staff would sell him their shares when they left. At the time, he owned less than 50%, and he dangled an enticing offer in front of them. However, instead of selling to him, they secretly sold their shares to a competing company. This all unfolded months after I had already left, so I wasn't around when everything blew up. The entire retrenchment plan backfired. I walked away with a solid settlement, and since my exit wasn't on bad terms, I was free to approach their direct competitor for a new position. Meanwhile, the employees who stayed ended up working under a large international corporation. Many had to accept demotions, pay cuts, or were forced to relocate. Looking back, had I stayed and begged to keep my job, I wouldn't be where I am today. Leaving was the best thing that could have happened. Story 35. Back in 2004, when I was 20 years old, I went on a road trip with my friend and her dog from California to Washington. We were on I-5 North at around 1 a.m., with my cruise control set to 75 miles per hour. The speed limit was 70 miles per hour. I was familiar with this drive since I'd made it multiple times before, visiting my boyfriend in LA while I lived in Seattle. I had even gotten speeding tickets on this stretch of road, so I made a point to be extra careful and always stay within 5 miles per hour of the speed limit. It was pitch black, early morning, and my friend had reclined her seat all the way back, taking a nap with her dog curled up on her chest. Suddenly, I noticed what appeared to be a car with flashing lights coming up behind me. As it pulled up beside me, I could see the car matching my speed perfectly. I couldn't see the driver clearly, but I had this feeling they were staring at me. Despite the strange feeling, I wasn't panicking. I knew I wasn't speeding, so I kept glancing at my speedometer to reassure myself. I even slowed down a bit to be sure. After what felt like forever, the car finally slowed down, swerved behind me, and turned on its lights. My heart sank as I began to pull over to the shoulder. I nudged my friend awake and told her I was getting pulled over. She asked if I'd been speeding, and I reassured her that I hadn't been, explaining that I'd been using cruise control. I was starting to feel uneasy, but I tried to stay calm. There was no reason for the stop. The highway was desolate, and we hadn't seen a gas station or rest area for miles. The officer walked up to the passenger side, where my friend was trying to sit up. When he saw her, he seemed genuinely surprised that I had a passenger. He started fumbling his words and said I was going 90 miles per hour, which was completely untrue. He was so flustered, he didn't even ask for my license. I had to ask him if he needed it. He went back to his car, and my friend and I exchanged confused looks. Her dog was acting frantic, barking nonstop, which was highly unusual. I had been pulled over before, so I knew the drill. Cops typically go back to their cruisers for several minutes, but this guy came back in just about 2. He tossed my license and registration into my friend's lap like he was annoyed, then told me to slow down and gave me a verbal warning. I thanked him, though the whole interaction felt off. Then, in a bizarre move, he got in his cruiser and floored it back onto the highway without telling me to pull ahead, which was unusual. Usually, they ask you to pull ahead so they can make sure you merge back onto the freeway safely. My friend and I were both shaken. She was more rattled than I was, but as time passed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right about the entire situation. It nagged at me. Years later, I heard about a cop in Northern California who had been arrested for pulling over young women late at night on I-5. He would stop them in desolate areas, making sure they were alone, and then essay them in his cruiser. His actions escalated, and he eventually murdered one of his victims. My blood ran cold when I heard about it. I can't say for certain that it was the same cop I encountered, but the similarities in his behavior were unsettling. I'll always be grateful for my friend's dog and her protection that night. Edit. The timeline is a bit fuzzy for me, as I made a lot of trips to and from California around that time, so it could have happened anywhere between 2002 and 2007. Still, after doing some light research, I found several similar stories of this kind of thing happening on I-5, and it's horrifying. Pro tip: if you ever feel uncomfortable being pulled over by a cop, especially in an isolated area, slow down, turn on your hazards, and call 911. If you don't have service, keep driving until you do. The dispatcher will relay the situation to the officer, and they'll escort you to a safer spot. They can also warn you if the cop isn't actually a police officer. Stay safe out there. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss an update.